Saturday the 12th of January 1828 would have begun as a normal working day for Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He'd have slept on a bale of straw for maybe 4 hours because he was working 20 hours a day. He was in charge of the most audacious engineering scheme the world had ever seen, digging a 1,200-foot-long tunnel under the River Thames. Now it's just part of the London Underground, but back then it was the first tunnel ever to go underwater. This was dangerous work. They knew that above them the river had been dredged. And they knew that where it had been dredged, big holes had been left in the riverbed. What they didn't know was where the holes were. But they were about to find out. The 6 men working alongside Brunel were swept to their deaths in the freezing torrent of river water and sewage. Brunel himself was knocked unconscious and washed all the way back down the tunnel to the main shaft. Waterlogged and a whisker from drowning, he was plucked to safety by his assistant, Mr. Beamish. And by that simple action, by pulling the sodden 22-year-old from the water, Mr. Beamish saved the life of a man who'd go on to become, quite simply, the greatest Briton of all time. Has a picture ever defined an age as clearly as this? It was taken at the height of Victoria's reign, when Britain pushed the world through a revolution that changed every last detail of our lives. And at the heart of this extraordinary transformation was one man, Isambard Kingdom, Brunel. So how did he pull us from the old agricultural world into the modern mechanized one we have now? So far as most people are concerned, all he did was the Clifton suspension bridge in Bristol. It was a breathtaking piece of modern design, audacious, brave, brilliant, the perfect monument to the man. All on its own, the Clifton Bridge would have put him in the history books.
But there was a little bit more than that. In fact, I've got a list. There was the Great Western Railway, the Bristol and Exeter Railway, the Taff Vale, South Devon, the Cornwall, the Bristol and Gloucester, the Wiltshire, Somerset and Weymouth, and the Piedmont Railway in Italy. Then there was the Hungerford Bridge, the Chepstow Bridge, Balmoral Bridge, Maidenhead Bridge, and the magnificent Tamar Bridge down in Cornwall. Paddington Station, Temple Mead Station, Kensington Observatory, the seawall at Milford Haven, the docks at Sunderland, and the docks at Plymouth. And we haven't even got to the ships yet.
The Great Western was the first steamship built to cross the Atlantic. The Great Britain was the first ocean-going ship to be made of iron. And the Great Eastern, well, that was just humongously vast.
So, on the basis of this list, Brunel built modern Britain. And Britain built the world, which means that Brunel built the modern world. And that makes him a pretty damn great Briton in my book.
200 years ago, Britain was the workshop of the world. But the only way you could move around it was on a horse. Brunel changed all that, galvanising Britain with extraordinarily bold and enormous heavy engineering. There was, however, nothing ugly about his work. He combined form and function to completely transform our landscape. Brunel put beauty into the beast of the Industrial Revolution. So why can't we build stuff like this today? Who paid for the grandeur?
Think about it. Back then, furs from here, wheat and tobacco from here, sugar from here, tea from here, silk and opium from here. Pretty well anything that moved anywhere in the world, the profits from that transaction ended up here. Money back then was coming into Britain in lumps, and the people who were making it were keen to invest in machines so that they could speed up world trade even more and make even more money. And that meant they had to invest in engineering.
Engineers back then were like rock and roll gods with a hint of Hollywood. They were a daring, dashing breed as they went around building a brave new world.
If someone had come here from France or Prussia or anywhere in, say, 1850, they wouldn't have believed their eyes. They had galleons, we had the Starship Enterprise. We were miles ahead, and pulling us along from the front, setting the furious pace, was the king of the hill, the mad, the outrageous, the brilliant Isambard Kingdom, Brunel.
So, what kind of man was he? And where did he get that name? Well, he was born here in Portsmouth on April the 9th, 1806. His mother was called Sophia Kingdom, hence the middle bit. His father, Mark, was a French refugee, hence the Isambard and the Brunel. Mark struggled to provide for his family, but his was a precarious profession. He was an inventor. In London, the Thames had become hopelessly congested and crossing the river was almost impossible. The queues at London Bridge were endless. A tunnel had been attempted without success. Meanwhile, Mark Brunel thought the answer to the problem might be these things. Shipworms. These chaps could wreak havoc. They burrowed through the wooden hull using the shells around their heads as cutting tools. Then they swallowed the wood and fed it out the back end to form a smooth tunnel lining, further protecting their fragile little bodies. Most people wanted to be rid of them, but Mark Brunel decided to copy them.
This is a model of what old man Brunel came up with, the tunnelling shield. A man would stand in each one of these compartments hacking away at the face, and the spoil was then taken out of the back end and carried to the surface. Then when they'd hacked away maybe 9 inches, you turn these screws, the whole shield moves forwards, and then someone comes along and lines the tube with another row of bricks.
This is the Channel Tunnel rail link just about to burrow under the Thames in Kent. And guess what? They are working in exactly the same way that Mark Brunel's tunnelling shield did. Obviously a bit more up to date, but otherwise identical. This work is pretty straightforward engineering now, but in Brunel's day, tunnelling underwater was a miracle of science. Very quickly the site became London's biggest tourist attraction. The stress of it all made Mark ill, so he handed over the reins to his apprentice, his genius son Isambard.
Unlike engineers of today, who are rarely seen in public without their Cornish pasty shoes and their plastic hats. Brunel was a showman with one eye always on the PR opportunity. So when he saw that every weekend thousands and thousands of people were coming to the East End of London to see how the tunnel was getting along, he realised he was running the greatest show on earth.
The public eagerly consumed all the latest instalments from this East End drama. Every conceivable trinket and souvenir was manufactured, but there was nothing frivolous about building it. The roof kept collapsing. The investors must have thought they were pouring their money into a black hole.
So, to keep the backers happy, he organised a lavish party down here. In today's terms, he'd have had Madonna and Guy, Hugh and Liz. Hello and OK magazines would have been fighting one another over the rights to publish the picture of Elton giving David a cheeky little hug. By day then, Brunel was risking his neck, but at night, he was schmoozing to save his face.
Young Brunel nearly died in the tunnel, but it did nothing to diminish his appetite for a challenge. To the last, he was a complete workaholic.
So what drove him? What was this precocious, prodigiously talented young chap really like? Well, he was a little man, and if you read through his diaries, which I have here, you can tell this bothered him.
Even of a dark night, riding home when I pass some unknown person who perhaps does not even look at me, I catch myself trying to look big on my little pony.
We can also tell he wasn't given to taking much in the way of time off.
My birthday. 2 steam pumps working hard, but pressure will not stop up. When the afternoon shift came on, they did not go below, but remained on top, grumbling about last week's wages.
In fact, it seems there was only one thing that was capable of dragging him away from work. Sex.
I have had, as I suppose most young men have had, numerous attachments, if they deserve them. Devilish pretty girl. Turn has appeared to me the true one. The sofa scenes must now appear to her, as to me, rather an excellent musician and a very sweet voice. She was a nice girl, and had she improved as a girl of her age ought to have done.
Well, we'll never know, because he's cut out the rest of the page. There was, however, one preoccupation that he had which was even more important to him than drive, ambition, work, or even sex. Even though this is a lockable diary and it was kept in a locked box far from prying eyes, he only ever wrote about it in a secret type of shorthand. The subject I'm talking about is money.
I'm most terribly pinched for money, should barely receive enough to pay my debts, and am at this moment without a penny. Let the worst happen, unemployed, untalked of, penniless. My poor father would hardly survive the tunnel.
Mark Brunel had done everything he possibly could to give young Isambard a good start in life. But he'd suffered terribly trying to provide for his family. The debts had mounted up and eventually he ended up in debtor's prison for 3 months. Now, I like to think that Isambard's burning desire to succeed was fueled by a need to right the wrongs that had been inflicted on his father.
After his accident in the tunnel, Brunel came here to Bristol to convalesce. But he wasn't much good at lying around, so while he was here he began to compete for the contract to build a bridge across one of Britain's deepest gorges. A daunting prospect. It was run as a competition and the entries flooded in, some more impractical than others. Brunel, who needless to say had never designed a bridge before, submitted 4 ideas. The leading civil engineer, Thomas Telford, was invited to judge the entries. He rejected all Brunel's ideas. In fact, he rejected everyone's ideas until he was asked to come up with a plan. This was it. And it's great, except building those enormous towers would have cost a fortune, and everyone in Bristol hated it. So in the end, Brunel won. And what did he think up for his winning design? Something classical? Baroque? Romantic? No. He wanted to give Bristol something exotic. The Battle of the Nile and stories filtering back from grand tours had fired everyone's interest in ancient Egypt. So that was the route he took. The design was one thing, but building it was something else. The Avon Gorge is 250 feet deep with sheer rock on either side. So getting building supplies from one side to the other was not easy. An iron bar, 1,000 feet long, was suspended across the chasm so men and materials could make the precarious journey in a basket. Presumably to dispel fears among his workmen, Brunel was the first to step into the basket. He was literally putting his life on the line for his beloved bridge.
He called it my first child, my darling. And he would risk everything for it.
Nice bottle. This one's still in the foot. Hey.
Hold on, you've got... Can you give me some slack?
Yep.
Oh, I can't go down. Unfortunately, when the basket got to about here, the rope snagged on a kink in the bar, and Brunel was left dangling 200 feet above the River Avon. Now, if he'd had a pen and paper on him, I'm sure he would have invented a helicopter and been winched to safety. But he didn't. So he climbed out of the basket, and to the amazement of everybody watching, got onto the iron bar, freed the rope, then got back into the basket again and carried on his way. He'd cheated death for a second time. Small wonder that one of the pubs named in his honour in the centre of Bristol is called the Reckless Engineer.
The basket was another fabulous publicity stunt. It speaks volumes for the man, even with today's rigorous safety standards.
No, look, something's... I'm sure... I didn't see it do this on the way over.
It's still pretty hairy.
Oh, well... Oh, my God, stop it! Look, stop that! Why is it shaking so much? Stop it! Right, stop! Stop! Stop now! This is just ridiculous.
He arrived at the other side completely unscathed, but tragically Brunel's darling bridge would not be completed until... The railway had arrived. At first, trains were simply used to move coal, the fuel that powered the empire. And by the time Brunel came along, there were tracks dotted all over the industrial north of England, from Liverpool to Manchester, from Darlington to Stockport, from Birmingham to London even. Brunel saw what was happening and thought, I can do much better than this. And so he began work on what would become the Great Western Railway. He saw a future where trains would travel at unbelievable speeds. His aim was London to Bristol in 4 hours. Now, one of the funny little things that you should know about Brunel was that he could draw a perfect circle. But when he took a ride on the bumpy Liverpool to Manchester line, this was all he could manage. He was appalled. He wanted comfort. He wanted a ride so smooth you could sip coffee as you raced along at 50 miles an hour. He therefore had to take complete control. Stations, locomotives, carriages, lampposts, even the width of the track would all be part of his integrated design.
Up north, railway tracks were 4 foot 8 apart. About that. And this is because the wagons in coal yards had always had their wheels that far apart, and the railway people just copied them. But Brunel wanted his tracks 7 feet apart. Let me show you why. It's brilliant. You see, here is a conventional railway track, 4 foot 8 apart, okay? Small wheels with the wagons sitting on top of them, full of coal. Fine. But Brunel worked out that the larger the wheel, the less the friction. And that led to another problem. You see, if you've got a conventional railway track and you fit big wheels, your carriage is up here. Passenger? How's he going to get in? Hopeless. So this is what Brunel thought. Put your tracks 7 feet apart, fit the big wheels, and then put the carriage between them. And so you look out of the window through the spokes. Think of the advantages of this. You've got a lower centre of gravity, you've got better aerodynamics, and with those big wheels, you've got less friction. That means better economy and something that changed the world. More speed. Brunel began to tour southern England with this, his walking stick. Except it's rather more than a walking stick. Let me show you. You unscrew the handle, like so. Take it off. Unscrew this at the bottom. Undo this little clasp. Pull that bit open, lock it in. Pull this bit open, and look, it's a measuring stick. 7 feet. Perfect.
The other railway owners didn't think the broad gauge was perfect. To a man, they opposed it. Then there were objections to the railway itself, not just from landowners whose estates would be cut in half by Mr. Brunel's supersonic iron snake. The Duke of Wellington, for instance, was horrified at the prospect of a railway. "It will encourage the working classes to move about," he thundered. And then there was the principal of Eton College. When he heard the railway would be going right past the school, he said it would tempt his pupils to visit the brothels of London.
So not only was Brunel charged with the task of designing this railway and getting shareholders to pay for it, he also had to use his considerable PR skills on a sceptical public. This was an immense undertaking. He had to be an engineer, an architect, a spin doctor, a financier, a lobbyist, and even a politician. For 11 days, a parliamentary committee set up to examine the feasibility of a railway all the way from London to Bristol cross-examined him mercilessly in the witness box.
To wake his lawyer in time for the hearings, Brunel hung some string between their apartments on opposite sides of the street. He would pull the string, a bell would ring, and his legal aid was awake.
How much would you give to be able to do that to your lawyer?
So what woke Brunel up? Oh, don't be silly. The man never seemed to need sleep. He just went on and on like the Energizer Bunny, until eventually, after 56 days, success. The committee was won over and he could finally get started. He wanted to make travelling a pleasure, so the railway had to be efficient and fast. And to get this speed, he had to avoid hills. He went to such extraordinary lengths to avoid a gradient that people started to call the railway Mr. Brunel's billiard table. Of course, it wasn't easy. London to Bristol, that's 118 miles of English countryside full of hills, valleys and problems.
The first obstacle he faced was this floodplain, about 11 miles to the west of London. Now, the cheap solution would have been to dip the line into it and then have a climb on the other side. But the climb would have slowed his engines down. So to save a few seconds on the journey time, he built that.
900 feet long with 8 arches, the Warncliffe Viaduct is beauty with a purpose. And like the Clifton Bridge, he gave it an Egyptian flavour. The safe suburb of Ealing had never seen anything like it. Even the cavities in the columns between the arches are geometric delights. Like everything on the whole railway, the attention to detail was astonishing.
As Brunel said, this was to be the finest work in all of England. Not the cheapest, but the best.
It was a fantastically bold vision, but it took its toll. The stress of it all gave Brunel nightmares. If ever I go mad, I shall have the ghost of the opening of the railway walking before me. And when it steps forward, a little swarm of devils in the shape of half-finished stations, sinking embankments, broken screws, unfinished drawings and sketches will quietly lift up my ghost and put him off a little further. And the nightmares weren't just in his dreams. The next obstacle on his route was the River Thames. The Thames commissioners gave Brunel a rough ride. They wanted a bridge high enough for sailing barges to pass underneath. Brunel wanted a low bridge so that the trains wouldn't need to climb to get over it. Brunel wanted 3 arches. The commissioners insisted on 2. The result was this, a bridge with 2 enormous 128-foot arches. Arches that are only 24 feet high. That's astonishing.
That was most people's idea of an arch in the middle of the 19th century. Tall, thin, bit boring. So when Brunel proposed an arch like that, low and flat and really rather amazing, all the experts said it would collapse. Brunel got to hear of these whisperings and mutterings and echoes. And so, on the day the bridge opened, he left all the scaffolding in place. Aha, said the experts, you see, man's an incompetent fool. Take the scaffolding away, you'll end up with a river full of bricks. But when he did take the scaffolding away, a year later, nothing happened. Bridge stayed up, still here today. And it's still the widest, flattest brick arch in the world. It's a beautiful bridge.
Placating landowners and cajoling contractors, Brunel continued to edge west. In Wiltshire, the locals were up in arms. The railway would end passing trade from the coach road, and they fought bitterly against the plans. One of Brunel's assistants suggested a team of men should sneak down at night and turn their beloved white horse into a train. Brunel loved the idea, but it was one scheme that sadly remained a dream. Ultimately, his iron snake would destroy the coaching trade, but until it was built, he needed the roads. He spent his days rushing around in a custom-built horse-drawn carriage. He slept in it. He always had to be on the spot. And poor Mary, well, there's very little evidence that he kept in touch. Only one letter, in fact.
He wrote it while he was staying at a place he jokingly refers to as the Cow and Candle Snuffers in the village of Wootton Bassett, which is just down there somewhere. Talks about how awful his room is, complains about the drafts. It's normal married stuff. Except, of course, there was nothing normal about Isambard's married life. He was never at home. I have no idea how he ever managed to start a family.
He did, though. He had a son, but at the time he was a little more bothered by these hills just outside Bath. They were a problem. But you don't become the greatest Briton of all time by jacking it in and going home to play dad.
He proposed a tunnel, 2 miles long. No, everybody said, you can't do that. 2 miles, that would be the longest tunnel in the entire world. It's impossible. But there was more. He built this exquisite, elaborate, and very expensive facade, but inside it was unlined. It was just bare rock. No, said the geologist, you can't do that. It'll collapse. But it didn't. And it still hasn't.
Even without aligning, it was a huge undertaking. It took 5 years to tunnel through, with up to 4,000 men working on it using just dynamite and their bare hands. The death toll was horrific. In percentage terms, you were more likely to die making this than you were in the trenches during the First World War. Then, shortly after its completion, locals noticed a strange phenomenon. Once a year at sunrise, light emanated from within the tunnel itself. It appeared that as the sun broke over the eastern horizon, it shone through the entire length of the tunnel. And the date when they said this happened? April the 9th, the birthday of one Isambard Kingdom Brunel. So did this brilliant engineer use his grasp of mathematics to create an immortal birthday present to himself?
No. You see, the latest research shows that the sun actually shines out of Brunel's tunnel on April the 6th, 3 days before his birthday. So did he make a mistake? Seems unlikely somehow. I prefer to look at it this way. He is responsible for the only thing on the entire British rail network that ever arrives ahead of schedule.
The opening of the box tunnel meant a straight and level run from London to Bristol in 4 hours, 13 hours faster than the mail coach. And Brunel didn't just make the world a faster place. Unlike any of the other Great Britons in this series, he actually changed time itself. When he began work on the Great Western Railway, Bristol was 11 minutes behind Greenwich Mean Time. Of course, back then the time difference didn't matter because no one could travel fast enough to be troubled by it. But the new railway meant they could. The railway moved the world forward 100 years, but as you can see from the clock on Bristol's Corn Exchange, which has 2-minute hands, it moved this city forward 100 years and 11 minutes. And the docking station for these early time travellers? Brunel's Temple Meads terminus.
It is impossible to overstress the importance of the Great Western Railway, and not just because it put Britain so far ahead of the rest of the world. Before it came along, the furthest you could hope to travel in a day was 10 miles. Afterwards, you could do 10 times that distance in a quarter of a day. And because you wasted less time travelling, you could do more, you could see more, you could work more, you could play more, you could learn more, you could lead a fuller life. Think of it as a wrought iron superhighway, a 19th century internet. Brunel's railway changed our expectations, it changed our aspirations, it changed everything.
Something the railway didn't change, however, was Brunel's habit of overspending. The railway cost over £6 million, 3 times the original estimate. But brilliant engineering will never be cheap. Take Concorde. £2 billion to develop, and that was in the 1960s. A truly Brunelian concept, though. A machine that took existing ideas and pushed them further than anyone could have imagined. He would have loved it, but he'd have made it 5 times bigger. Concorde was the 20th century's answer to a problem that Brunel himself had grappled with: crossing the Atlantic. He'd had an idea, a big one, as usual. He wanted people to catch the train in London, get off in Bristol, and then board a steamship bound for New York. And never mind that he'd never actually built a ship before, or that the Atlantic had until that point only been crossed under sail.
Now, you'd have thought that by this time people would have learned to keep their mouths shut whenever Brunel proposed something. But no. One of his critics said, "Steam navigation of the Atlantic is about as plausible as sending a man to the moon."
For once, it seemed that the prophets of doom were to be proved right, and with horrific consequences. The ship was built in Bristol, but was fitted out in London. Brunel, as you'd expect, was on board when it sailed down the Thames estuary to test the engines.
When one of them overheated, Brunel scampered down into the bowels of the ship to see what the problem was. Unfortunately, one of the rungs on one of the ladders collapsed and he fell 20 feet. Now, had he landed on a solid floor, he would undoubtedly have been killed. But unluckily, for the man he landed on anyway, his fall was broken. And there you are, once again, his refusal to delegate, his need to be at the thick of the action, getting his hands dirty, had nearly cost him his life.
Brunel and his assistant duly recovered, but doubts still persisted about the ship. No one believed it could carry enough coal to get across an ocean. But they weren't geniuses, and Brunel was. At the age of 10, he'd been able to grasp the geometry of Euclid. So at 29, he had no problem working out that a 200-foot ship may be twice the size of a 100-foot ship, but that it doesn't need twice as much fuel to power it. He developed a complicated mathematical formula which showed a skeptical world that when it came to steamships, the bigger, the better. And when the Great Western arrived in New York, guess what? Brunel was vindicated. It still had coal to spare, 200 tons of it in fact. She was such a success on the transatlantic run that soon there was demand for a sister ship.
Now, sister ship. They were probably expecting to take delivery of something about the same. That's what sister ship means. But not to Brunel it didn't. So he came up with this, the SS Great Britain, the biggest ship the world had ever seen.
Not just the biggest either. She was also the first ocean-going liner to be made from iron, and the first to have a propeller instead of paddle wheels. She was a turbo galleon. She was the space shuttle in a wooden world. God knows what they must have thought in New York when she sailed into the harbour there for the first time.
Everything about the Great Britain was gigantic. Its pistons were more than 7 feet in diameter. This was a Brunelian nut and bolt, and you should see his idea of a spanner. Look at that. God.
Sadly, though, the Great Britain was destined for a pretty miserable life. On just her 5th trip to New York, she ran aground off Ireland. People thought the iron hull could have confused the captain's compass, but Brunel had thought of that. It was just bad navigation and bad luck. And there was worse to come. The Great Western Steamship Company couldn't afford the repairs, and to Brunel's horror, she was sold. The new owners used her on the Australia run, but in a vicious storm off Cape Horn she was damaged and then dumped on the Falkland Islands, where she became a warehouse for storing coal and wool. This was the most advanced ship in the world, and look what they did to her. Letting her rot would be like using the capsule from Apollo 11 as an ashtray. The story does have a happy ending though, because in 1970 she was rescued and brought home to Bristol. And I'm delighted to say she's now been restored and sits in a permanent dry dock, so you can come and marvel at what in terms of modern shipping is Genesis.
And the extraordinary thing is that a modern propeller designed by a computer in the 21st century is only 5% more efficient than this propeller, which was designed by a Victorian bloke in a tall hat. Guy was a genius.
The Great Britain was launched in 1843, the same year that the Thames Tunnel opened. 2 astonishing feats of engineering in the same year from the same man, and he was still only 37. At home, remarkably, Mary had given birth to a second son. And even more remarkably, it does seem that Isambard was actually quite a good father.
So one day he was at home doing that old trick where you push a coin into your ear and it comes out of your mouth or your elbow. But unfortunately it went wrong and it ended up in his lung. Now most people would have panicked when conventional medicine failed to get it out again, but not Brunel. Predictably, he resorted to engineering and made himself a pair of forceps, which could be inserted through a cut in his throat down his windpipe. Must have been fantastically painful and rather worrying because the operation didn't work. In desperation, Brunel and his father developed what we would now recognise as a physio table. Isambard was strapped to it, turned upside down and shaken vigorously until, to the accompaniment of much rejoicing in the streets, the coin popped out. And apart from the physio table, he also invented rifling down the inside of a gun barrel, he built Florence Nightingale's hospitals, and he developed an iceberg warning device 50 years before Titanic. You see, the thing is, Brunel always built everything for a reason. Which brings me neatly on to the dome. In many ways, I suspect he'd have loved this place. He'd have loved the size of it, that's for sure. The sheer scale is very Brunelian. He'd have loved the extravagant use of other people's money too, but most of all, I suspect he'd have loved the engineering. By using these 300-foot tall steel masts to support a sort of spider's web of cables which then support the roof, the actual structure weighs less than the air inside it. I think we sometimes forget just how clever this place is. However, Brunel would have absolutely hated the pointlessness of the place. If you told him that it was built for a party rather than a purpose, he'd have had a duck fit.
The problem with the dome is that we had nothing to put inside it. It's a far cry from 1851, when we built the Crystal Palace to show off all the innovations that were powering the empire ahead. Brunel was on the committee, of course, but he had very little to do with it. His main preoccupation at the time was a mile down the road. The crowning glory of the Great Western Railway. Paddington Station. Today you're distracted by the shops and bars, or you're glued to the departure boards wondering if your train's been built yet. But don't be distracted. Look up. It's breathtaking. It's beautiful but totally functional. The planet and star-shaped holes on the ribs, they were places where you could attach cleaning gantries. And these pillars double as downpipes to let water run off the roof and drain away. And now you can board the train to Heathrow. Paddington has become London's gateway to the world, just like Brunel planned 160 years ago. Did he know Paddington would last this long? I think so. There was an air of indestructibility.
On a conventional suspension bridge, like this one, you build a tower like the one I'm standing on one bank, and then a tower on the other bank. Then you sling a couple of cables between them and hang the roadway from those cables. Then, to stop the weight of the roadway pulling the two towers into the river, you have more cables going down the other side, which are anchored into solid rock. Now, Brunel's bridge is also a suspension bridge. If you look, there's the railway part is suspended underneath those flat grey bits there. But, and no one knows why, Brunel didn't tie his towers back. Instead, he used those great big tubular metal things to push them apart. Britain today? Well, there's the usual reasons. Engineers aren't paid enough, we don't respect them enough, and engineering projects tend these days to be run by accountants. But there's another reason. Brunel. The man was so prolific that by the time he'd finished, there was nothing left for anyone else to do. And there was no point hanging around waiting for all his works to fall over, because think about it, Paddington Station, the Thames Tunnel, the Clifton suspension bridge, they're all still here. Most people are remembered by a little blue plaque on a crummy house somewhere because whatever it was they did has long since faded away. But we're reminded of Brunel wherever we go by his huge ironworks that are held together with rivets the size of fists and bolts like Volkswagens. When he built stuff, he built it to last.
By the time he came to see the bridge opened, Brunel was a broken man. He had grown tired and disillusioned by railways. His visionary broad gauge had been killed off by the other railway companies. They were only interested in making profits, not better railways. I endeavour to comprehend the present extraordinary state of railway matters when everyone around seems mad, stark, staring, wildly mad. The only sane course for a sane man is to get out and keep quiet.
Brunel didn't keep quiet though, far from it. In fact, he was about to make the biggest noise of his entire career. These slabs stretching into the Thames from the Isle of Dogs here were to be the launch pad for the biggest, most impressive, most astonishing engineering feat probably ever, actually. Probably ever.
In his mind, he had the idea for another ship. He was thinking about building something called the Great Eastern, which would be able to sail all the way to Australia non-stop without refueling. And now there was another weapon in his PR arsenal: photography. This revolutionary new medium recorded each faltering step, each anxious glance, as well as the image that immortalized Brunel. He looks relaxed here, doesn't he? Confident. But the truth is, this ship was tearing him apart.
Now, the Great Britain had been a big ship in its time, make no mistake about that. But now he was thinking about making something twice the size. A Leviathan. Technically speaking, it would be something like this. This was the size of a normal ship in the middle of the 19th century. This was the size of Brunel's Great Western. This was the Great Britain. And now he was talking about doing something this big. Nothing this enormous had ever been attempted before, and nothing this enormous would ever be attempted again for 50 years, until the Lusitania came along. It was an absolute monster.
Alongside the photographers, artists came to paint it, and journalists to write about this huge thing that was towering over the London skyline. Like the Thames Tunnel 30 years earlier, Brunel had scripted another East End soap opera, and Londoners were captivated by each new shocking episode. He went into business with a shipbuilder called John Scott Russell, but it was a stormy partnership. They quarrelled over who was in charge, and work fell behind. The finances spiralled out of control. Huge quantities of materials went missing. Brunel was mortified. Money was so tight that he was reduced to listing the contents of his house, fearing he'd have to sell his silver to save his ship. The company directors became so desperate for cash, they even tried to claw back a few quid by selling tickets for the launch. Thousands came, but the ship was too heavy to budge. Brunel felt publicly humiliated. Finally, they got it afloat and the problems really started. During trials, 6 men were killed when a funnel exploded, and on her maiden voyage, there were only 38 passengers. There was simply no demand for a ship this big. So the Leviathan became a transatlantic cable layer. And then what? Where is it now? Well, it didn't sink. It didn't hit an iceberg. Its last days were spent as an advertising hoarding on the River Mersey. And then it was simply broken up for scrap. Only one piece of this magnificent ship survives, in the most unlikely place. That's all that's left of it. The flagpole which today stands outside Liverpool Football Club. What a tragedy. Brunel didn't even live to see the ship sail. 5 minutes after he posed for this last photograph, he collapsed from a stroke. 10 days later, he was dead. His bridge in Bristol was completed 5 years later as a tribute, and rightly so. You see, at around this time, Darwin told the world where we had come from, but Brunel had done something so much more important. He took us to where we were going. You know, I'm slightly amazed that someone like Princess Diana is being discussed in this series. I mean, I'm sure she was a very lovely lady, but she's not really in the same class as Brunel. And John Lennon, I am the Eggman, I am the Walrus. Quite. And then there's William Shakespeare, a man who's brought stupefying boredom to the classroom for 400 years. Let me put it this way. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Puck says he will put a girdle around the earth. Shakespeare wrote about it, but Brunel, with his bridges and his ships and his trains, he actually did it. Greatest Briton ever? I'm absolutely sure of it. Good night.
Our favourite 100 Great Britons, with in-depth analysis of the top 10 nominations and exploring the reasons for their enduring popularity.
Please visit our website for news about new productions that are on the way, and you can support my work on my Patreon page.